Chag Sameach, and welcome to my session, Jewish Truth in the Post-Truth Period. It is an honor to be teaching here for all of us here in the community, and it's a topic which I believe is one that is still current. We know from the last several years that the topic of truth is one that has been discussed quite a bit. There are those people who feel that truth with a capital T is something that is absolute and we should be able to identify the truth. And there are others who say that, well, truth is kind of squishy and a little bit messy and that there are alternate facts and what's one person's truth is not necessarily another person's truth. So today's examination is to take a look at truth in terms of what our tradition has to say about truth. We'll begin by taking a look at some biblical commentaries and then at some biblical verses, and then taking a look at what Musar, the tradition that urges us to build better characteristics, to make ourselves better people, what it has to say based on some writings from Alan Marinis in the book Everyday Holiness. One of the soul traits, one of the midot, one of the characteristics that we're supposed to try to improve within ourselves is the characteristic of truth. So we'll take a look and see what that has to say and how it might give us some direction as we move into the future in what many people have said is a post-truth era. I'm going to start out by taking a look at a midrash. This midrash comes from Genesis Rabbah, and it goes back to the beginning of the book of Genesis in chapter 1. There's a verse, chapter 1, verse 26, says the following: Let us make human beings in our image. And this is God speaking. And the question is, first of all, to whom is God speaking? And second of all, to bolster this question, what exactly is the us? Or who exactly is the us? If God is the only thing that existed up until that point because human beings hadn't been created, to whom is God addressing this and what exactly does it mean? And so since there's this sort of missing piece in our biblical verses, the rabbis imagine a scene, they put together a scenario in which the following things happen. It says, Rabbi Shimon taught that at the time when the Holy One came to create the first human being, love said, let the creation occur, for this creature will do loving things. But truth said, let the creation not occur, for the creature will be all lies. Justice said, let the creation occur, for the creature will do justice. And then what did the Holy One do? God took truth and hurled it to the earth. So we have here is this imaginary conversation between truth and justice and love. And they're arguing as to whether, in fact, God should create human beings. And that's why God addressed them. God addressed these beings as if to say, let us make these human beings, but I'm not exactly sure. What do you think about it? And love says we should do this because they'll be so full of love. Truth says, I don't know, they're going to be full of lies. And justice says, no, they will do justice. And by the way, this is translated in many different ways. You may see versions of this story a little bit different. But what did God do? God took truth and hurled it to the earth. So this is a little bit confusing. What exactly does that mean to hurl truth to the earth? Whereas the others are having this conversation up in the heights, up in the heavens. So the Midrash continues, what good would it do to only banish truth? Peace, which by the way is left out of this little piece that we had, but peace is also part of the discussion. Peace had argued against the creation of human beings, but peace wasn't thrown down to the earth. So if we think that maybe God was sort of like taking the negative Nelly and throwing that down to earth, peace, and it's not recorded again on the slide that we have, but in different versions, peace argues against it, saying that human beings will do nothing but be full of war. And it says the answer is that in banishing truth, obviously there would be peace. For the root of quarreling is that everyone battles for his or her own truth. But if truth is pushed off to one side, there's nothing left to argument, no one to denounce, nothing left to argue about, no one to denounce peace. So the argument is here that the one thing that sort of is problematic for peace is truth, because not everybody sees truth the same way, and one person's truth might not be the same as another person's truth. For instance, for some people, their truth might be that chocolate peanut butter cup ice cream is the best ice cream out there. My truth might be, you're wrong, it's butter pecan. This is true for me, that might be true for someone else. We have differing truths for each other, and this might lead to a quarrel, and it might lead to, on an issue not quite as mundane as ice cream, it might lead to some kind of conflict or even a war. And certainly we know from our history that people have different versions of, my truth is that this piece of territory belongs to us, or that these resources belong to us, and this is the basis of war. So we have this very early midrash from Genesis Rabbah on chapter 1 of the book of Genesis that already tells us that truth with a capital T, which we would think of is immutable, recognizable, and completely definable, maybe not so much. I want to compare this with some verses that appear in the Torah itself about truth. The first one, and these are all from the 1985 JPS translation, is a verse from Exodus chapter 23, verse 7. It says, "Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent and in the right, for I will not acquit the wrongdoer." This is God speaking through Moses to the people and telling them that in a time when they should be called before a magistrate or a judge, that they should tell the truth. And they should make sure that they are telling the truth about those who are innocent and those who are guilty. And a person who does not tell the truth in such a situation will not be acquitted by God. There's another verse that comes from Leviticus 19, 11 through 12. "You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord." If this sounds familiar, this is a little bit of an expansion or a riff on not taking God's name in vain, which we recognize from the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, where we're told that we shouldn't use God's name in vain. In other words, we shouldn't swear falsely by God. And then we have another verse which comes from Leviticus, just a little bit later in the chapter from the second verse. "You shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. You shall have an honest balance, honest weights, an honest ephah, which is a measurement, and an honest hin, which is another measurement." So we know that from the verses in the Torah itself, that there seems to be very strong evidence for us to tell the truth and to be very punctilious about it, right? It's not okay to have weights and measures that are not exactly accurate. It's not okay for us to tell something that's maybe not exactly accurate. The verses from the Torah seem to us to say that you've got to tell the truth and you've got to do it in every situation. Of course, this takes us back to the earlier midrash that we looked at about the creation of human beings, and we can see already that we've got these conflicts. The Torah that says truth is so important, it's immutable, there's a capital T, there is the truth and there is that which is not true. And already by the time we get to Genesis Rabbah, we see that it's being softened up just a little bit. There's another famous midrash, and this one is taken from the Talmud. It is from the Bavli Ketubot, pages 16b through 17a. There's a little typo at the end of the slide here. It says 71. It should be 17a. And this is the rabbis having a discussion about what possible circumstances might warrant not telling the truth. The sages taught, how does one dance before the bride? So what does one recite while dancing at her wedding? So we know that there is a midrash that says that we have a mitzvah, a commandment, to gladden a bride on her wedding day. And one of the ways that we do this is by complimenting her and telling her how beautiful she is. So the rabbis are asking about this commandment when you dance before the bride and you say things to her while you are entertaining her. And you may have been to a wedding where people come and the bride and groom sit in a big chair and people dance in front of them. Well, 2,000 plus years ago, this was going on as well. So here's the question. Beit Shammai say, one recites praise of the bride as she is, emphasizing her good qualities. So what is it that Shammai is responding to here? The commandment says that you're supposed to tell a bride that she's beautiful. Well, what if maybe the bride isn't beautiful? Maybe if she's plain, What do you say to her? So the house of Shammai says, you shouldn't lie. You should praise her as she is. You should talk about her good qualities. So instead of saying, you look so beautiful and so gorgeous today, you might say, little Rachel, one of the things I love about you is you're always punctual. Okay, so this is what the house of Shammai says. Beit Hillel say, one recites, a fair and attractive bride. In other words, you should say to her, you are fair, you are attractive, even if it's your own personal view that she's not so beautiful. Beit Shammai responds to Hillel and says, in a case where the bride was lame or blind, does one say with regard to her, a fair and attractive bride? But the Torah says, keep you from a false matter. Exodus 23:7, which was the first verse that we looked at in the previous slide. In other words, Shammai is saying, wait a second. You want us to lie when we already know that we're not supposed to lie. So what we see here is a clash of conflicts. On the one hand, we're supposed to gladden a bride. That's one commandment. On the other hand, we're supposed to tell the truth. But by telling the truth, we can't gladden the bride. And by trying to gladden the bride, we can't tell the truth. We have a clash of values here. How do we handle it? Beit Hillel says to Shammai, according to your statement with regard to one who acquired an inferior acquisition from the market, in other words, what if someone goes to the market and they get something and it's not so good? They purchase not an actual lemon, but they buy something that's a lemon or something that Consumer Report says is the worst thing that you can buy. Should one not praise it and enhance its values in the eyes, or condemn it and diminish its value in his eyes? In other words, if someone comes to you and says, look at this new car that I just bought, should you say, oi, I just read in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that this is like the worst car, it gets horrible mileage, the resale value is terrible? Or should you say to someone who just got a brand new car, wow, I just saw something, one of those on the road, and I remember driving past it and saying, wow, what a sharp looking car. You must say that he should praise it and enhance value in his eyes and refrain from causing him anguish. In other words, whatever your thoughts may be, once someone has acquired the car or a piece of property, you don't want to cause them any pain or anguish, so you shouldn't tell the truth, but rather you should find a way to praise it. Now, we know from our tradition that in almost every single case, Hillel is chosen, the view of Hillel is chosen over the view of Shammai, mostly because of the reasons that we see here in this text, which is that the house of Beit Hillel understood that the truth was sometimes a painful and difficult thing, and sometimes we needed, for the sake of peace, for the sake of making someone happy and saving them from pain, to not exactly tell the perfect truth of what we see before us. And from here, the Midrash continues in Ketubot, the sages learned, or the sages said, a person's disposition should always be empathetic with mankind. In other words, when we speak, whether it is to say something we might consider to be a white lie or it's a truth, we should consider the effect that it will have on the person to whom we are addressing it, and treat everyone courteously. In this case, too, once the groom has married his bride, one praises her as being fair and attractive. It's interesting, of course, that the Talmud doesn't say anything about what you should say to the bride at this point. It's what you should say to the groom. In other words, you don't want to feel the groom to feel badly, and we can talk about what that exactly means. But what we should take away from this text is the idea that in the Talmud itself, the rabbis understood Shammai and Hillel from their story, that there were times when telling a white lie is not only permissible, but preferable. So where does this leave us? How do we know where to draw the line? How do we know when we should be truthful? As if we're under oath in a courthouse, or when there are times when it's perhaps not only permissible, but preferable to not exactly tell the exact truth. Now, there are some examples that we can think of on our own. For instance, a surprise party. If someone says to you, what are you doing Saturday night? You're not going to say, well, to tell the truth, I'm going to a surprise party that's been planned in your honor for your birthday for the last 2 months, but since I must tell the truth, I'm going to ruin the surprise. We know examples like that. We know the story from the Talmud of Hillel and Shammai, but we also know other examples where it might be a little bit better to fudge the truth a little bit rather than tell something that is exactly the truth. We know that this is a difficult line to try to walk, to try to understand how to do it. And Alan Marinis in Everyday Holiness, the Jewish Spiritual Path of Musar, gives us some guidance. So on this slide we read, we have to let truth emerge from our judgment and to accept that puts the onus on us to maintain a very strong inner compass. If we listen to our own heart of hearts with sensitive ears, we will receive guidance that directs us to where the real truth lies. Right? So here he talks about truth and then like real truth, something that's deeper than the truth. And in order to do this, we have to rely on a very strong inner compass. Of course, having that inner compass relies on us having studied and learned and understanding how to be an empathetic person, to understand the repercussions of not telling the truth. Once we know that, it helps us to build a strong inner compass, and that will guide us to know how to figure out where the real truth lies. The Torah and the teachings of the rabbis give us all the guidance we need, but to follow the path that lies before us still calls for a discerning heart. In other words, we can't just rely on the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Torah. There's something personal. We have to rely on something within ourselves to make sure that we do the right thing. This is the ultimate instrument for recognizing what is true and for guiding our speech and actions. Now, we use the word ultimate all the time, like it's the ultimate in stereophonic sound as meaning the best. But what ultimate really means is the last. This is the last instrument. This must be the final thing that we use to judge what is true and guiding our speech and our actions. It's the heart that calls you to go looking for guidance from the tradition when that's available. And it is the wise heart that will show you in the myriad of situations, show you the way in the myriad of situations for which there is no black and white answer. Right? So sometimes there are black and white answers. What color is that sweater? It's red. Either that's true or it's not. There are other situations where maybe it's a little bit more difficult. Al Marinis continues, we all have a discerning heart. This is something, of course, that God gives us. It plants within us. Though its voice may be quiet or even muffled or drowned out by other inner voices. We may also not be so familiar with its language. Musar, right? This learning, this way of trying to make ourselves better, to build these positive characteristics within ourselves, tells us that one of the primary tasks on the spiritual journey is to cultivate and exercise that implement of skillful discernment, the wise heart. Only then will we become the masters of truth with all the judgment, discernment, fearlessness, and wisdom that mastery implies. So in other words here, there's something within our hearts, there's something within ourselves, a voice, which, as he says, at times is very strong, at times might be drowned out, there might be conflict, there are other voices telling us, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, and yet on a third hand. And there might be other times where we don't exactly have the vocabulary to know what's the right thing to say or the right thing to do. If we, however, work on building our empathy and studying and turning to our tradition and seeing what those before us have had to say, if we use all of those, we can begin to cultivate a better way of having discernment, of knowing when exactly to tell the truth, when exactly to tell a white lie. And this is only possible with wisdom when we use a wise heart. And only when we have that can we truly master truth. It is not something that is beyond us, according to Musar, according to Marinis. It is something that we can control. It requires, however, judgment, discernment, a certain level of fearlessness, right? Sometimes we have to be not afraid to tell the truth, and sometimes we have to be not afraid to not tell the truth. And of course, the wisdom that mastery implies. So living in this world in which we find ourselves, in which there is truth or post-truth, How do we know when to tell the truth? How do we know when to not tell the truth? And I think it's helpful for us to go back to the story of Hillel and Shammai and to take a look at the Talmud and to understand that what we have to do is, in all cases, ask ourselves, what would be the thing that would be most empathetic to mankind? What would be the thing that would cause the least amount of grief and pain and difficulty for another person? And that's oftentimes going to be a good guide for us as we move forward. Now, this is in itself also rather complicated. For instance, if you have someone who has a terrible diagnosis, is dangerously ill, do you tell them the truth or do you hide the truth from them? And sometimes, by the way, a patient doesn't want to know the truth, doesn't necessarily want to hear exactly what it is. We hear about people who know that they have a terrible diagnosis. They don't want to hear from a doctor, you have 3 to 6 months. They would rather not know that because it's too painful. And these are very difficult judgments that we have to make. It requires a great deal of love and discernment. It's not easy. It's not like the capital T. There is truth and there is that which is not truth. Our tradition recognizes that there are various gradations. But we also have to recognize there are times when things are simply bald-faced lies. And sometimes those lies are repeated over and over again. And we need, by the same token, to not be afraid to call out those lies for what they are. If those are lies that do not lead to empathy, do not lead to peace, do not lead to justice, do not lead to loving kindness, but rather lead to chaos and to subjugation and injustice. I know that this is a complicated topic. I know that even I have not mastered truth in my old age. But hopefully these texts give us a sense of what our tradition has to say and can further guide us as each one of us works to build a wise and discerning heart. Again, Chag Sameach, and have a wonderful Shavuot.